concessions to slaves than concentration camp commanders ever made to their inmates. Concentration camps in both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were far less economically efficient than the totalitarian societies of which they were a part, but they were maintained despite this, for political purposes. Slave plantations were profit-making enterprises, inherently limited by that fact in how far they could go in oppressing or destroying the sources of their wealth. Whatever moral equivalence may have existed between the two kinds of institutions, they were neither politically nor economically equivalent. A unifying ideology is essential in a totalitarian state, if only so that its multitudes of organizations do not work at cross purposes to such an extent as to be self-destructive. In the intentional terms of totalitarian belief or propaganda, power is exercised in the service of the ideology. However, in view of the ease with which Nazi officials became communist officials after World War II, it is also possible that the ideology is exercised in the service of power. Certainly, it is hard to imagine totalitarian state power without a unifying ideological theme, and history presents no examples. The particular ideology may be a creation of the totalitarian leader, as in Hitler's National Socialism, or may have an historical tradition, as in Marxism. However, even in the latter case, the ideology may still be instrumental rather than controlling. Certainly, people following Marxism, as distinguished from using Marxism, could never set up a totalitarian state. Marx and Engels opposed autocracy, much less totalitarianism. The whole point of the proletarian revolution, that is, a revolution from the bottom up, was that revolution from the top down implied a post-revolutionary dictatorship over the proletariat. Lenin's revolution from the top down confirmed the Marxian fears, but Lenin was not bound by the original meaning of Marxism, and in fact reinterpreted Marx to justify what he had done. Ideology is not only instrumental or a producer's good for the government, it is also a consumer good for the populace or segments thereof. Totalitarian ideology typically features 1. The localization of evil in Jews, capitalists, or some other group, so that comprehensive political solutions to age-old human problems seem feasible within a reasonable time horizon by surgically removing the offending group, leaving a healthy body politic intact. 2. The localization of wisdom, to explain why this miraculous cure has escaped so many minds for so many centuries, as well as explaining the necessity for superseding democratic institutions and beliefs. 3. A single scale of values by which priorities may be arranged in every field of human endeavor to be achieved at all cost. 4. The presupposition of sufficient knowledge to achieve whatever goal may be projected. 5. The urgency of the problem to be solved, so that ruthlessness is the lesser of two evils. And 6. A psychic identification with millions, whose opinions may nevertheless be disregarded and whose lives may be sacrificed in the cause without feelings of guilt. Finally, the totalitarian ideology must be a self-enclosed system to exclude alternative views and visions, which are, regardless of their substance, inherently antithetical to a single totalitarian ideology. It is therefore central to totalitarian ideology that it convert questions of fact into questions of motive. Facts are a threat because they are independent of the ideology, and questioning the motives of whoever reports discordant facts is a low-cost way of disposing of them. An ideology may be viewed as a knowledge-economizing device, for it explains complex empirical data with a few simple and familiar variables. It is hardly surprising that ideological explanations should have a special appeal to those with higher costs of alternative knowledge, the inexperienced, youth, and the previously politically apathetic, masses. As a leading student of totalitarianism has observed, it was characteristic of the rise of the Nazi movement in Germany and of the communist movements in Europe after 1930 that they recruited their members from this mass of apparently indifferent people whom all other parties had given up as too apathetic or too stupid for their attention. It is also in keeping with the concept of ideology as a knowledge-economizing device that there should be defections with age, as discordant knowledge forces itself on one's attention until a point is reached where the cost of reconciling it with the ideological vision exceeds the cost of discarding the vision itself. Explaining complex reality with simple and familiar variables is a low-cost process initially, but this cost tends to rise over time as ever more complex relationships must be postulated between the simple variables and the accumulating complex reality, much like the Flat Earth Society explaining away phenomena which have long ago convinced others that the Earth is round. Indeed, when theories are viewed instrumentally rather than as literal reconstructions of reality, the reason for preferring the round Earth theory is basically an intellectual economizing process. The incremental investment in a slightly more complex initial assumption than a flat Earth is later repaid by lesser intellectual effort in reconciling the results with empirical observation. It is a question of cost-effectiveness rather than of reaching ultimate immutable truth. For the initiate in totalitarian ideology, however, cost-effectiveness may lie with the simple assumptions, because authentication is a sequential process in which the full costs will be revealed only in the course of time. He may also be more interested in the power than in the cognitive advantages to be derived from totalitarianism, or may become so oriented in the course of time. This consumer good aspect of totalitarian ideology is an essential part of the phenomenon. The hypnotic fascination and exhilaration with which Hitler's followers listened to his speeches was an integral part of Nazism. Among communists, the vision of the ideology itself, the wretched of the earth creating a new world, substitutes for oratorical genius, and has in fact proven far more effective with intellectuals. The intellectual delight and intellectual bliss on reading the Marxian vision, the sense of revelation when the whole universe falls into a pattern like the stray pieces of a jigsaw puzzle assembled by magic at one stroke, the thrill when the revolutionary words leaped from the printed page and struck me with tremendous force, these are part of the psychic rewards for the total commitment that characterizes totalitarian movements. Because Marx and Engels had already paid the high fixed costs of creating the vision, latter-day Marxists could achieve ideological results at lower incremental costs. They need not possess Hitler's genius for oratory or for discerning exploitable human susceptibilities. It is only in the light of such ideological visions that it is possible to understand the confessions to non-existent crimes which have been produced not only in Soviet courts, but even in communist movements in Western democracies, movements possessing no tangible power to punish their members. The ideological context dwarfs the particular characteristics of the particular individual, as in this description of an internal party trial among American communists in the 1930s. There had to be established in the minds of all present a vivid picture of mankind under oppression. At last, the world, the national, and the local picture had been fused into one overwhelming drama of moral struggle, in which everybody in the hall was participating. This presentation had lasted for more than 3 hours, but it had enthroned a new sense of reality in the hearts of those present, a sense of man on earth. Toward evening, the direct charges against Ross were made. The moment came for Ross to defend himself. I had been told that he had arranged for friends to testify in his behalf, but he called upon no one. He stood, trembling. He tried to talk, and his words would not come. The hall was as still as death. Guilt was written in every pore of his black skin. His hands shook. He held onto the edge of the table to keep on his feet. His personality, his sense of himself, had been obliterated. Yet he could not have been so humbled unless he had shared and accepted the vision that had crushed him, the common vision that bound us all together. "Comrades," he said in a low, charged voice, "I'm guilty of all of the charges. All of them." His voice broke in a sob. No one prodded him, no one tortured him, no one threatened him. He was free to go out of the hall and never see another communist. But he did not want to. He could not. The vision of a communal world had sunk into his soul, and it would never leave him until life left him. Conversely, without the commitment to the ideological vision, even the horrors of slave labor camps could not silence Solzhenitsyn, Sakharov, or other Soviet opponents of totalitarianism. Ironically, the first book that Marx and Engels wrote together in 1843 contained a scathing indictment of the practice of first breaking down individual self-respect and personality and then attempting to reconstruct a human being according to some preconceived plan. The hero of a contemporary novel had made a religious conversion in that way. Marx and Engels pointed out that with his smooth, honeyed curse, he had first to soil her in her own eyes in order to make her receptive to the redemption he would offer. The lofty motives with which this was done were simply camouflage for the zealot's lust for the self-humiliation of man. Even in a political context, Marx had no use for the idea of state indoctrination. Confessions to non-existent crimes illustrate another characteristic of totalitarianism, the concept of political truth. Not only people and organizations are subject to total control, so too is the truth. Hitler's use of the reiterated big lie and numerous Soviet revisions of official history, complete with airbrush erasures in historic photographs, are part of a pattern of control that extends to the basic data itself. This is more than the usual political lying common to systems of various sorts. It is monopolistic lying, with the exclusion of alternative sources of information. Moreover, it is lying on principle, or rather, it is a philosophy that regards what is said as largely instrumental, so that the very distinction between lying and the truth becomes blurred or even regarded as trivial or naive. Political truth is whatever will advance the interests of the cause or movement. Quite aside from ethical questions, this approach makes the same assumption of omnicompetence that is central to totalitarianism as a whole. The philosophic postulate that statements are instrumental may be necessary, but by no means sufficient as the basis for lying as a principle. It is not that philosophical postulate, but the empirical presupposition of virtually zero incremental knowledge costs, omniscience, for some subset of people, leaders, that is crucial for the conclusion. Even viewed from a wholly instrumental perspective, the ethical norm of truth is a cost-saving social institution for people for whom knowledge is not a free good. If the set of such people includes all of humanity, then instrumental lying has social costs which cannot be assumed to be less than whatever benefits are contemplated, either for society at large or even for the subset who engage in this wholesale disinvestment in credibility. The presumption is indeed the other way. The systemic evolution of ethical norms of truthfulness in the most diverse and separated cultures around the world and down through history suggests something of the instrumental value of truth. Similar ethical norms in this regard originating in the prehistory of the human race, when the species was even more separated and fragmented than today, hardly seem the product of coincidental philosophic intentions rather than of systemic universalistic experience. It is difficult even to conceive theoretically of a society that could survive if statements had no more probability of being true than if they were generated by a process that was random with respect to truth as a value in itself. Even totalitarian governments invest substantially in the production of truth, including secret police and torture, from an instrumental point of view. The substitution of instrumental consequences for empirical truth as the criterion for statements is by no means the substitution of a more manageable standard. The usefulness of an opinion is itself matter of opinion, as disputable as open to discussion and requiring discussion as much as the opinion itself. The sweeping scope and arbitrariness of the assumption that one can trace the instrumental consequences of particular words and deeds may be indicated by asking whether anyone could have foreseen the consequences of a certain Italian explorer's theory that he could reach India by sailing west, a set of words and deeds that led to the discovery of half the planet and changed the course of history in both halves. It is especially ironic for totalitarianism to assume such omniscience, since it was precisely totalitarian oppression which drove from Germany and Italy the men who gave America the decisive military weapon of World War II and ushered in the nuclear age, Albert Einstein and Enrico Fermi. Conversely, imagine a being with zero incremental knowledge cost, someone able to discern the remotest ramifications of his every statement. Why should such a being be bound by ethical norms of truth, either from the standpoint of self-interest or even if making the interests of humanity the paramount determinant of his behavior? If he knows to a certainty that saying A would on net balance, in all its ramifications, be more beneficial to mankind than saying B, would it not be blind, fetishistic traditionalism for him to say B? Would it not be self-indulgence to say B in order to salve his own conscience at the known expense of perhaps millions of his fellow creatures, now and in the future? This is only to say that if human beings were entirely different creatures, entirely different principles might well apply. More practically, a choice among principles involves an understanding of the inherent limitations of the species and its surrounding circumstances, rather than a comparison of what would be the best mode of operation in an unconstrained world. The instrumental case for truth is the instrumental case for human institutions in general, ultimately knowledge costs, which is to say, the unattainability of omniscience. Courts are preferred to lynch mobs, even when it is known to a certainty in the particular case that the accused is guilty, and even if the lynch mob inflicts exactly the same punishment that the court would have inflicted. The philosophic principle that we should not take the law into our own hands can be viewed instrumentally as the statement that, however great our certainty in the particular case, we cannot supplant legal institutions as cost-saving devices because we cannot assume equal certainty in future cases. If we could know with certainty, zero incremental knowledge cost, in all cases who was guilty,